Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. This program is being presented in partnership with libraries in Ashland, Bedford, Danvers, Dedham, Natick, Needham, Quincy, and Tewksbury. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, and I'm sure you will, please enter them into the Q&A or chat, and Greg will answer them at the end of the program. Today, Dr. Greg Skomal will be talking about his book, Chasing Shadows, My Life Tracking the Great White Shark, written with Ret Talbot. This presentation highlights this remarkable conservation success story, which is loaded with cutting-edge science, drama, and controversy. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Greg Skomal. In addition to being an accomplished marine biologist, underwater explorer, photographer, and author, is a leading white shark expert in the Atlantic. He is a senior fisheries biologist with the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries and currently directs the Massachusetts Shark Research Program. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Massachusetts Intercampus Marine Science Graduate Program, an adjunct scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and a member of the Explorers Club and the Boston Sea Rovers. Greg has authored dozens of scientific research papers and has appeared in a number of film and television documentaries, including programs for National Geographic, Discovery Channel, PBS, and numerous television networks. He is a regular on Shark Week and Shark Fest and is the author of the Shark Handbook. He holds a master's degree from the University of Rhode Island and a PhD from Boston University. He lives with his family in Marion, Massachusetts. Welcome, Greg. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, Helen. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss not only my book, Chasing Shadows, but also the research we're currently doing right here in Massachusetts on the great white shark. So thank you. Tonight I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the history of white shark research in the Atlantic, and I go into it in a little bit greater detail in the book. The book has three major sections, talking about previous research on white sharks, my move to Martha's Vineyard, and my early career studying sharks in general, and then the part of my career I'm in right now, which is working on the species in Cape Cod. This talk is not necessarily going to reflect that sequence of events. It's going to talk about a little bit of history of white sharks, then dive into what we're doing now and the questions we're trying to answer and the tools we're using. Because most of you probably live in the Massachusetts area. You're very curious about this species. We see a lot on television, in the media, and I want to try to clear up some of the facts and separate them from some of the myths and talk about the tools we're using to study this animal to answer some pressing questions. So let's see if this works. I'm assuming everybody can see me and the presentation. I think many of us remember this film. It is called Jaws, and it was a blockbuster film. Oh, I just noticed somebody's joining from Louisiana. That's really cool. Welcome. Welcome. I did a bunch of research with LSU years ago. I talk about that in the book a little bit. So yeah, welcome for people from far and wide. For me, the movie Jaws had a profound influence on my life. At the time, I was in middle school, and I was graduating from middle school. And so I was relatively young. And I became very fascinated by the film, not only the beast in the film, which by today's standards, I think looks pretty fake, but by 1975 standards was really cool looking. But more importantly, I was intrigued by this character, Matt Hooper, who is the marine scientist in the film. And I decided at an early age that he had a really, really, really cool job. And that was something I might be very much interested in pursuing as a young adult. So I geared up my life to go on to study biology and to become Matt Hooper. Of course, not knowing much about sharks, but being very, very fascinated by sharks like most kids. I like to describe myself as someone who just never outgrew that fascination. Now let's fast forward 4 more years, and I was graduating from high school, and I decided I would move on to the University of Rhode Island to study marine biology and oceanography. At that same year, in 1979, I didn't know it at the time, but there was a landmark study being conducted by a researcher from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and his colleagues. The name of that guy was Frank Carey, and two of his colleagues that I became very good friends with and ultimately would study under were John Casey and Harold Pratt. The paper was the very first acoustic tracking of a great white shark in the world. And that's because acoustic technology, which you're going to learn a lot about in this talk, was just emerging as a new tool, to the extent that the only person or the handful of people on Earth who had acoustic tags were those who were making them in their laboratory. So pictured in this photo on the right is Frank Carey on the left and Jack Casey on the right. And Frank was building acoustic tags in his lab at Woods Hole. And I like to think of these two guys as actually the real Matt Hoopers at the time. And of course, at the time, I didn't realize it, but just a few years later, I would join Jack in his lab just down the road from the University of Rhode Island campus. And ultimately, I would become one of his technicians. But what's really cool about this track is, and it's just a glimpse into the biology of the great white shark. So here's a photo of Frank Carey on the pulpit, which is that long stand emerging from the bow of this vessel. And he had just placed a tag on a white shark that was feeding on a dead whale. And these two figures are directly from that research paper, which was published a couple of years later in 1982. And what you can see in the upper right is actually the movements of this shark, where it was tagged just south of Montauk Point on Long Island and tracked for about 3.5 days all the way to Hudson Canyon. And the shark largely remained offshore. This bottom graphic shows the vertical movements or the diving behavior of this white shark over the course of those few days. And what you can see is the shark largely remained in the top 10 meters or 30 to 40 feet of the water column, but every now and then would dive down to the bottom. And although this just lasted a handful of days, this was the first glimpse of, on a global scale, of the behavior of a great white shark. And researchers all over the world were absolutely fascinated by this paper. And it was the first use of this technology, an acoustic tag, on a fish to follow its movements, you know, in time and space. And by today's standards, 3 days is absolutely nothing when it comes to tracking a fish. But in 1979, early 1980s, it was a monumental step forward. And it was on this iconic species, the great white shark. And what's really kind of fascinating, and at the same time, you know, odd to think about, but for the next 30 years, we really didn't learn much about the behavior of the white shark in the Atlantic until we started doing our research in the early 2000s. And so this persisted as the only glimpse into the biology of the white shark in the Atlantic. But other parts of the world, they were studying the white sharks, and the Atlantic lagged behind. What we did have in terms of, you know, knowledge about this species, in addition to that 3-day glimpse, was the distribution based on capture records dating back as far as 1800. In a paper published by Jack Casey, again, the man I was working for, and Wes Pratt, in 1985, and we updated it in 2014. This was the state of the art in terms of what we knew about the distribution of this species. And this was published in 85. And each one of these little green dots actually represents a white shark that was captured, or at least, at the very least, witnessed by a fisherman or somebody on the water or a scientist. Most of these are capture records. And if you look at them, there's really not that many when you think in terms of historical records. There's a little over 600 little green dots here. And those 600 green dots tell us that the white shark is largely distributed from the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So, from Louisiana up the eastern seaboard of the United States as far as Newfoundland, Canada, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And this was what we knew about the distribution of the species. As you're going to see later in this talk, is that this is only partially correct. If you look at this, it looks like the white shark is largely a coastal species. And we have to be careful with these data sets because they're based on fishing reports, and therefore they can be biased. Biased data will lead us to conclusions that are not accurate. And as you'll see later, this is not accurate. But again, it was state of the art. Now, working for Jack Casey and his research program in Narragansett, Rhode Island for the National Marine Fisheries Service, I was doing all kinds of basic natural history research. When I say natural history, it means we were trying to tease out aspects of the biology of a number of shark species that occur not only in New England, but along the eastern seaboard of the US. And we did that largely through necropsies. And that means we were sampling dead fish. So a lot of my early research involved sampling dead fish, doing dissections and necropsies. And so we were able to, looking at various tissues from sharks, including the great white shark, because some of these green dots were brought into the shoreline and shipped to Jack's lab, where we had a chance to sample them, we can learn a little bit about their biology. But when we sum it all up in terms of our ability to predictably find this species, we couldn't. So we always labeled this species as rare event and not one we were likely to learn a lot about. But like I said, some of these little green dots were brought into marinas and boatyards and fish houses, and we had a chance to do dissections. So this is a small great white shark that was sampled in the late 80s. And it was about the size they're born. We also had access in the mid 80s to large adults. And so this is a large adult male that was harpooned by fishermen. And we would do these necropsies, sample various tissues. Some of the most obvious stuff is to look in the stomach, for example. If we look in the stomach of a shark, we can see what it eats. Perhaps something less obvious is looking at the vertebral column of a white shark might tell us its age because there's banding patterns or rings like a tree in the vertebral column of sharks. And so we can count those rings and come up with age estimates. So what I'm going to show you in this next video is an actual necropsy on a great white shark that we conducted in 2016 on a specimen that had beached itself and died. And so I hope some of you aren't eating your dinner, but it moves very, very quickly. It's time lapse from actually Halloween of 2016. So what it is a team of scientists from various institutions like Woods Hole, like the National Marine Fisheries Service in Rhode Island, my lab, various universities, and each one is sampling various tissues to get a sense of the biology of this animal by studying those tissues. So whether it be the vertebral column or the liver or the heart, the circulatory system or the stomach, we can learn a lot about that animal in terms of its natural history. And a good example of that is a paper we published a few years ago on the growth rate of white sharks. So these are all the vertebral columns collected since the 1960s, and we counted the banding patterns. And you could see a section of the vertebral column here on the left. And each one of these bands is counted, and we can plot the size of the shark relative to the number of bands, assuming there's one band per year or two bands per year. And that's when it gets tricky. But what's really fascinating about this particular graphic is it shows you that white sharks live in excess of 70 years. And that is something we did not know. So it's a very slow growing animal. Now, as wonderful as it is to do these necropsies, and believe me, I've done hundreds on dozens of species of sharks over my career, this doesn't tell you very much about the behavior of the animal. All we had was Frank Carey's tracks, and all we had were a whole bunch of green dots that gave us a sense of the distribution of this animal. But one of the things that Frank Carey talked about is that there are hotspots around the world where white sharks are predictably found, okay? And each one of these little pink stars you see on the right is one of these hotspots. And the more historical ones include South Africa, South Australia, New Zealand, the Farallon Islands off California, Guadalupe Island off Mexico. These are places where researchers, filmmakers, divers, explorers have been able to encounter white sharks predictably, to make films, to take photographs, and to study their biology, right? And the one thing that these hotspots have in common is the distribution of white sharks, which you see in gray on the right side, overlaps with their most frequent prey item, the one they prefer. It's food that looks like this, and you see it on the left side of your screen, and that is seals, sea lions, pinnipeds is the general group that we call them. Where white sharks overlap with large, dense quantities of pinnipeds, you're going to see these hotspots develop because basically, to keep it simple, these are like restaurants that draw white sharks. Big white sharks in excess of 3 meters or 9+ feet. They prefer to feed on larger prey like seals, like sea lions, dolphins, porpoises, and they're scavenge whales. And so you'll see I've added a star to the Cape Cod area. And that's because we've been seeing some changes along our coastline up here in New England over the course of the last 20 years. My first hint that white sharks were starting to come back to Massachusetts and New England in larger numbers and closer to shore was in 2004, when I got a phone call from a friend, and I talk about this story pretty extensively in the book because it's fascinating from many perspectives. He told me that a white shark had swum into a small island estuary not far from where I was living. At the time, I was living on Martha's Vineyard Island, running the Massachusetts Shark Research Program, which I had started in 1989. So I went over to this salt pond, which is a tidal estuary not far from where I live, and there was this large 13-foot female swimming in this shallow water. So I was pretty excited. This was my first encounter with a live white shark. I had seen a bunch of dead specimens. I had visited South Australia to be with white sharks as part of my passion to pursue this species, but I had never had any opportunities to see live white sharks in my backyard. And that's indeed what this event represented. And so what we did was we put a very sophisticated brand new tag technology that was just emerging in the 90s and early 2000s, and that was satellite linked tags. These were tags that archived data like temperature and depth, and you could put them on the shark and they could stay on the shark for up to a year. And then at a time or a date programmed by me, that tag would come off the shark, detach, and float to the surface and report the data collected over that time period. So look at how far we had come since Frank Carey's homemade acoustic tags that lasted a few days to a satellite link tag that could last for up to a year. And so I put this on the shark, and I talk about the details of this particular individual and the fact that after I tagged it, it would not leave this salt pond. It would not exit high tide, low tide, full moon, you name it. We coaxed it. We did everything we possibly could. And slowly the shark became weakened and debilitated. And what I found was really fascinating is this became a major, a story that was covered by not only local and national media, but international media. Our desperate moves to try to get this shark out of the pond before it died because it was slowly debilitating. So it became a political hot potato too, because the island that this particular shark was trapped on was a very private island owned by a private foundation that didn't particularly care for news media helicopters hanging overhead. Ultimately, after 2 weeks, we were able to coax her, get her out of the pond. I'll let you read that chapter in the book to find out how we did it. But I will tell you, it was one of the most exhilarating and fascinating moments of my life, but at the same time, one of the most disappointing, because just 45 minutes after we got her out of the pond, her tag detached and floated to the surface and basically told me that she was trapped in a salt pond. So the tag actually had made a decision that it thought that these tags are so sophisticated, they make decisions based on software programming, it thought that the shark was dead and wanted to tell me immediately that this shark had died in this shallow salt pond. And actually it wasn't. We coaxed it out, but the sequence to detach itself had already been initiated. And after looking at the data, all we did was find out that this shark was trapped in a salt pond. But it was an indication, perhaps, that white sharks were returning to our waters in larger numbers and in greater densities. And that's because we, in 1972, on the eastern seaboard of in the United States, had afforded seals, sea lions, dolphins, porpoises, whales, all cetaceans, which are whales, the highest level of protection through the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So after, what was coming up on 40 plus years of protection, now in excess of 50 years of protection, seal populations are beginning to rebound or have rebounded off the northeastern United States. And this particular shark was probably drawn to our coastal areas to feed on the growing population of seals, just like we see in other hotspots around the world. So here's that shark, and as she swims by your screen, you'll look at her dorsal fin, and just behind it, you'll see that satellite tag that came off early. It looks like a cigar case with a ping pong on top. Actually has a little antenna. These tags run about $4,000, but they are the latest and greatest technology. And I bet you the late Frank Carey is rolling over in his grave, wishing he had access to this. What was also happening in the early 2000s, at the time that that shark swam into the salt pond, is that various stranding networks, and I know this isn't the most beautiful photo to look at, but it was what we were looking at quite a bit in greater frequency as it went into the early 2000s. And that was more and more seals turning up on the beach with these massive bite wounds. And believe me, there's really only one species of shark that occurs off the northeastern United States that can render this kind of wound. So we were getting this indirect evidence that white sharks were beginning to feed on seals, but we had not yet seen the white sharks. And these are the kinds of densities of seals that I'm talking about. It's estimated that by the end of the 18th century, white seal populations had already been really hit very, very hard by early settlers and Native Americans. And then, we continued to harvest seals through the 19th and 20th centuries. We had bounty programs in place. But in 1972, we gave them that protection. And when you open a restaurant that looks this good, you're going to draw its customers. And the old saying is the customers are the men in the gray suits, or sometimes referred to as the tax men. And that is white sharks. And so here's a great visual of a white shark in hot pursuit of a gray seal in the shallow coastal waters of a Massachusetts coastline, and specifically off the outer beaches of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Now, what we didn't count on with this, seemingly successful conservation story and restoration of the ecosystem is that in the time that seals and sharks were not here, Cape Cod had developed into a tourist-based economy. And we drew people from all over the world, and we continue to draw people from all over the world in the United States, obviously, that come to vacation on Cape Cod. And a lot of that is driven by activities such as surfing, paddleboarding, kayaking, you name it, scuba diving, you name it. And so now we have a top predator, the great white shark, feeding on seals, overlapping with these human activities. And so as, I move along in the book, I talk about the complexity of this situation and where I found myself personally. I remember as a kid, wanting to be Matt Hooper, but I didn't think it would involve having to deal with shark bites, shark attack. And that's exactly what started happening on Cape Cod. What you see here in this graphic is a number of yellow dots that indicate where shark bites occurred. In 1936, prior to 2012, our last fatal shark attack in Massachusetts was in 1936, and that's that green dot you see up in Buzzards Bay here, not far from New Bedford, not far from actually where I'm sitting right now. We had nothing for decades until 2012 when a swimmer was bitten up here off Truro, northern Cape Cod, and then a series of events leading up to 2 attacks in 2018, one of which involved a fatal attack on a boogie boarder by the name of Arthur Medici. So as you can imagine, these kinds of events are not only traumatic for the victim and their family, but also for the community. And Cape Cod was very much concerned about now this dynamic occurring off their beaches. And so a lot of the third part of the book, I talk about, like I said, the complexity of this issue, and then our approach from a scientific point of view. So this led to us trying to answer some very, very basic questions about the biology of this animal so that we can enhance public safety. And so the question in particular, which we started focusing on a few years ago, was trying to reduce these kinds of interactions between sharks and people. We felt that the best way to do that was to study where, when, and how white sharks feed on seals, to try to get a sense of their patterns of behavior that would be indicative of information that we can use to augment public safety. So this involved observing behavior directly and indirectly to look for those patterns, and to see if there's any environmental correlations. I mean, a lot of times you'll hear from scientists who study sharks, don't swim at dawn or dusk. That's a pattern that applies to some species of sharks. And so we're looking for those kinds of patterns because that's directly useful to the public in terms of enhancing public safety, because patterns obviously can ultimately lead to forecasting. And this is a tall order. It's not something that's easy to do. We have literally billions of data points related to our weather, and we're still, mediocre at forecasting that. So imagine trying to forecast the behavior of an animal and where it's most likely to be feeding. But nonetheless, the goal was to try to enhance public safety using a variety of technologies. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of these technologies and answer some of your basic questions, which are the same questions I have, and questions that are relevant to the public that will help them, avoid. Now, remember, I have to emphasize that the probability of being bitten by a shark remains incredibly low. But I'll also go back and reiterate the fact that even a single shark bite can have profound effects. And so even avoiding just one is critically important, obviously. So the tools we're using is acoustic telemetry. And we'll talk about acoustic telemetry because this is the exact same tool that Frank Carey built in his lab, only it's much better. It's increased in terms of its capacity and ability to last much longer than just a handful of days. And we use a variety of arrays, which I'll talk about. We're using these satellite link tags, which have gotten better and better. And we're using new animal-borne imaging tags, which is just a fancy way of saying we're studying their behavior using cameras that we're actually putting on these sharks. And as you can imagine, drone technology has really exploded in recent years. And so we're using drones as well to study their behavior. Again, our goal is to observe behavior as best we can. Our technique for tagging is very different from other parts of the world. Instead of chumming sharks, that is putting fish parts in the water and drawing the sharks to us, we go to the sharks. We're so close to swimming beaches that we don't want to modify the behavior of those sharks. So here's a sequence where you see our tagging vessel tagging a white shark that's free swimming right off the coastline of Cape Cod. And you'll see the boat at the top of the screen, which has a very long pulpit, very similar to the stand that Frank Carey was using way back in 1979. Our boat's smaller, it's a lot faster. It allows us to get to sharks over a very broad area, anywhere along the outer Cape. We also have a tower on the boat, which the captain uses to see the shark and communicate with a spotter pilot who's in the air telling us where that shark is. You're going to see me holding this tagging pole. Affixed to the needle on that tagging pole is a small dart that is tethered to an acoustic tag that emits a very high frequency sound. And I'm going to place it right at the base of the dorsal fin using the same exact technique used by Frank Carey years ago and by Jack Casey on literally hundreds of thousands of sharks since the 1960s. So when I hit that with the tag, you'll see it jab it at the base of the dorsal fin. The shark obviously is going to react because we're sneaking up on a big fish and spooking it, but it's going to go down and then come back up and then behave normally. So we're not doing anything to alter its behavior. To date, we have put tags on sharks ranging in length from as small as 4 or 5 feet long up to 18 feet in length using these 3 technologies, right? And a lot of people ask me, where do you see white sharks? And I love to show them this graphic. And that is basically anywhere along the outer Cape, as well as a couple of spots in Cape Cod. But the one thing I don't want you to conclude from this data set is that there's no white sharks anywhere else around the Massachusetts, because just like my little green dots, these pink triangles are biased data. They reflect where we're working and not necessarily everywhere where white sharks occur. That's important to keep in mind. But the acoustic technology, of which we've tagged well over 300 now, will give us unbiased data sets. And we're going to walk into those data sets. And just to talk about the acoustic technology, instead of putting this very high frequency tag on a white shark and following it with a boat like Frank Carey did, we use acoustic receivers, which we set up in arrays throughout Massachusetts. And researchers all over the world use the same technology to study a variety of species in the water. And so when the shark swims within the detection range of one of these receivers, the receiver will timestamp who that shark is and the date. So we get data from these receivers and we set them up. As you can imagine, if we want to know if a shark is off a popular swimming beach or if they ever come to a popular swimming beach, we can place one of these receivers there. We can place one over the seal colonies. We can place them everywhere to get a sense of where these sharks spend their time when they arrive and when they leave. This is an animation that gives you a sense of how this technology works. Each one of those yellow dots represents acoustic receivers we've set up around Cape Cod, and each one of these little animated sharks is tagged with an acoustic transmitter that is detected by a receiver, and a timestamp of that individual is archived. We then collect the receivers at the end of the year, typically early the next year, to figure out where sharks spent their time and their arrival and departure times. So let's answer some simple questions, same questions you guys have that I have. And the question in terms of when, where, and how do white sharks feed on seals? So all we're going to do is anytime one of these acoustic transmitters on a white shark swims in range of a receiver, it's detected. So that's considered a detection. It's a time and a date. We can plot the number of detections against month of the year, and we can see a very, very distinct seasonality in Massachusetts. And this is very, very much reflective of New England and Canada as well. With sharks beginning to arrive, believe it or not, as early as May, but in very low numbers, and then ramping up as we get into July, with peak months in August, September, and October. And then as temperatures cool down, sharks will begin to leave in November in big numbers. And by mid to late December, they're all gone. So, in terms of, water usage, yeah, most people don't want to surf in the winter. But if you're concerned about your safety and you think that sharks are a danger, then you surf during the off season. So we're already beginning to provide information about the presence of these animals. So we've sorted out the time they're here. What about where they spend their time? Are they evenly distributed throughout Cape Cod or throughout Massachusetts, or do they occur in higher densities in certain areas? And certainly, as you look at this graphic, it's the latter. What we've done here is we've simply taken the locations of all of our receivers, and we've made those receivers proportional to the number of sharks that are detected on them. So what really jumps out at you here as you look at these data is that the white sharks seems to spend the bulk of their time on the outer Cape. So these are those eastward facing beaches where these seal densities are the highest. As we move west, certainly the eastern side of Cape Cod, the Bay has higher densities of sharks, but the numbers diminish as we move up toward Boston. And there's not a lot of white sharks that visit Cape Cod Bay. I should say Nantucket Sound, Buzzards Bay, Nantucket and the Vineyard. So they really are focused on the outer Cape where these seal densities are highest. So now I'm going to show you an animation of actual data that we've collected back in 2019 that show the movement of sharks into Massachusetts on a seasonal basis. And the date, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, will reflect, as we progress through that season. And it's currently saying June, but we'll march through. I'll start this animation and you'll get a sense of the increase in sharks as they migrate into Massachusetts. And again, those predominantly eastward-facing beaches where those bubbles really blow up, or where the number of detections and sharks are spending the high amounts of time. Every now and then you'll see these receivers along the South Shore light up because white sharks are progressing up into the Gulf of Maine, but they don't spend a lot of time there. They move right through. And as we move into September and October, those bubbles remain high. But as you'll see, we get into early November, those cold northeast winds begin, and these sharks will move out fairly quickly because although the seals are there year-round, the white sharks leave. They want out of there because the water temperatures are simply too cold for them. So we're really starting to work out the hot spots in Massachusetts where white sharks occur. So if I'm managing a beach along the South Shore, let's say over here in Situate, Duxbury, Plymouth, there's not a lot of white sharks. So that your public safety issues are not great, as opposed to if I'm managing one of these beaches along the outer Cape. Perhaps the most difficult question for us to answer is how they go about hunting seals, because we have to physically observe how that's happening. Now, we can do it directly by being on the water, or indirectly by using technologies that reveal what these animals are doing when we're not there. So I'm going to talk about that, those approaches. Obviously, if we're on the water and our pilot's up in the air and he sees a big bloody spot in the water, that's typically a white shark that has successfully killed a seal. And this is one of those instances. These are the direct observations that we've collected over the years. But remarkably, although I've been doing this now for 14 years, we really have only seen less than 50 of these events. So it's tough for us to really pin down what's happening, particularly in areas where we don't sample, and also what's happening at night. We can't see anything at night, so we're not out on the water at night. But we do go out on the boat, and when we're out on the boat, we get these really interesting observations sometimes. Many of you who watch Discovery Channel or National Geographic or whatever, you may have seen white sharks leaping out of the water, and that predominantly occurs off South Africa. Here in Massachusetts, because the water is so shallow, these sharks typically don't leap. But I'm going to show you a couple of film clips where we actually recorded white sharks breaching. One of these events occurred where a white shark was circling a seal haul-out area. The seals in the area were very, very close to the shore. They were smart. They knew that they stay shallow, the white shark couldn't get to them. But there was one particular seal that came in from offshore from behind us. And so what you're going to see in this footage, and it's going to happen quickly, but I'll slow it down in the next sequence, is this seal coming direct contact with a white shark. And the seal decides it has only one way to get away from this shark, and that's by going straight up in the air. So take a close look at this footage. It's going to play in real time. That's the seal going up in the water, and then the shark breaching after the seal. We're going to slow that down. We're going to zoom in. Again, you're going to see the seal come straight out of the water to avoid the shark, and the shark's going to follow it. Now, for those of you rooting for the seal wins, swims, it gets to the beach. The shark failed to kill it, and I don't really believe the seal ever went back in the water again. But that was a valuable lesson that seal learned. So it's this game of cat and mouse that white sharks play. This next sequence I'm going to show you is a video that actually involved the white shark breaching after me while I was on the pulpit of the boat. So I'm going to play this, and you're going to see me on the pulpit of the boat. And what I'm doing is I'm holding a painter's pole that has a GoPro on it. And the first thing we do when we approach a white shark is I videotape that shark to determine, what markings it has, what color patterns, so we can use it to identify that particular individual. And so you'll see me there. I'm going to place that. I'm going to place that pole in the water and try to record the shark. But I don't see this particular shark because that water is like coffee or tea. It's very dark. And the spotter pilot is trying to describe to me where that shark is. So I don't know if the sound is coming through on this particular video. But look underneath me. And again, I'll slow it down. But that's the pilot's voice telling me where it is. And I'm getting ready to videotape it. Now, underneath me, you're going to see the shark jump up.
Oh, holy crap! It goes right out of the water. Man.
So I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to zoom in again. And this is what it's like, I think, to be a seal. The shark comes out of the water, mouth wide open. See me do my little white shark shuffle. And then I'll go back to work, obviously. But these are rare events. They do happen. But every now and then, you know, in my case, fortunately, the shark didn't get me. But in this case, the shark did get a seal. All right. So here's a shark consuming a seal. And I want to show you the sequence because we do observe it. And when we do, we will collect as much information as we possibly can. This is a gray seal. It's a smaller one. It's been bitten in half and killed immediately, instantly. And the white shark, what it's doing is it's going to attack and it's going to try to rip the very rich, thick blubber layer that these seals have, you know, and that's really what it wants. Think of it as the bacon of the seal. So this shark wants to consume that seal and bite it into smaller pieces, rip off. If it's a much too large a seal for it to completely consume, it's going to just take that blubber layer off, but it'll try to consume as much of it as it can. And as you can see, we're not far from shore, and we're collecting data on, you know, where that shark is, what's the water depth, what's the water temperature, trying to assemble that information that'll give us a sense of where and when these animals are most likely to be consuming and attacking and killing their natural prey. And hoping, of course, to use that information to enhance public safety. But as I said, we can't be everywhere all the time. And we don't have enough data to draw any major conclusions yet. So now we have to start looking at indirect methods. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about 2 indirect methods, and we're going to start wrapping things up. One of these methods is shown in this really boring figure you see in the middle of your screen. You know, this is Head of the Meadow Beach, which is a beach in Truro. It's managed by the National Park Service. The beach is along the south of the bottom of this particular figure. You can see actual Google Earth image of the beach. You also see these green triangles. Each one of these green triangles is an acoustic receiver that we've put out in the water, but you'll notice they're spaced really close together. And what this allows us to do is triangulate the exact positioning of each shark as it moves through this fine scale or acoustic array. And that allows us to see what their behavior is like close to shore without actually seeing it. And what you also see here is a whole bunch of colors, you know, that's related to the bathymetry or the water depths in this particular area. You know, the lighter blues and the purples are very shallow water. The yellow and reds are very deep water. And what you really see here is kind of cool. As you move from the shoreline out, you see a sandbar in purple that's only about 2 to 3 meters deep. And then you'll see this deep trench in yellow, and then another sandbar. This is very characteristic of Cape Cod in general, multiple sandbars that are actually shifting and changing every year, if not every month. So now we're able to look at the behavior of the shark as it relates to the habitat in the area. And that's exactly what this animation is showing you. Each one of these black dots represents one of our acoustic receivers spaced very, very close together. And that yellow, that dotted white line is the actual path of a white shark as illustrated by that red triangle as it moves through the area. And what you can see is the shark, because it is an ambush predator, is going to stay in that deeper trough, hoping to ambush seals as they move off the beach out into deeper water to feed. And this is a perfect tactic and perhaps quite obvious, but it works very effectively. And so when I talk to lifeguards and the general public, I tell them, understand the beach you're swimming at, what it looks like at low tide, what it looks at high tide, where those trenches might be that might be hiding a white shark that is ready to ambush its prey. So that's wonderful technology. Again, same acoustic technology, a little bit more advanced than when Frank Carey used it in '79, that is giving us observations of the behavior of these animals in really, really fine scales. The last tag technology I'm going to finish up with is these camera tags. I call them behavior tags. Some researchers call them acceleration data loggers because they record all kinds of information related to the movements of the animal, as many as 20 times per second. So I know what that shark is doing 20 times per second, whether it's turning right, left, accelerating, slowing down. And I can see how that behavior is related to what it's actually doing by looking at the camera technology. So here's a big 14-foot white shark with a camera tag system on its back. There's a close-up of the camera tag system, and it looks big, but it's extremely light. It's incredibly hydrodynamic, and it doesn't create a lot of drag because of that. And so the shark doesn't feel this big, heavy weight. You'll see that it's tethered to a smaller tag. That's a long-term acoustic tag. Instead of lasting 3 days like Frank's tags, our acoustic tags last 10 years. So we can track the movements of this individual shark over multiple years. And this little linkage here is what corrodes and allows this tag, the camera tag itself, to come off. And that'll come off after 1 to 3 days, depending on how I program it. Okay, so what we're doing is we're collecting such intense behavioral video observations and data that we need to go get the tag in order to offload those data. So let's look at a sequence of events where we deployed this tag to study the behavior of a white shark. All right, and now remember, we don't have to be there, and we can study what the shark is doing day, night, throughout the time period. So what you see on the left side of the screen is 3 seals in extremely shallow water. These are what I call smart seals, because they know that if they stay that shallow, the white shark is not likely to attempt to attack them. That white shark is just outside of these seals, and it's hoping one of these seals messes up and decides to swim offshore. Eventually, that shark becomes impatient. And I know that sounds like I'm adding human emotion to it, but I do that just to describe this behavior. This shark decides, I don't care how shallow you are, I'm going to come in and try to eat you. And so this is an actual photo by my pilot, Wayne Davis, of a white shark coming in hot and heavy on a seal right in the surf zone. So those waves are breaking on the beach. Now, this is a dangerous predicament for a white shark because if it miscalculates, it can end up on the beach and it will die. And remember, the seal, by all accounts, does not want to be consumed by a white shark. And so the seal is going to do evasive maneuvers. So think of it as this game of cat and mouse, kind of a chess game when, the shark attacks the seal changes its behavior so it doesn't get attacked. And the seal is far more agile in the water than the white shark. The seal can turn on a dime. It's got great eyesight and it's pretty smart compared to a white shark. And so, what did this look like from the perspective of the tag that we had on the shark? So here we have we're riding the back of a great white shark, and you can see the tether system here going right up to the acoustic technology that's going to stay on the shark. And so this is what it's like to live the life of a white shark or to ride the back of one. This shark is slowly moving in to shallow water, and at some point it's going to accelerate up to 10, 15, 20 miles an hour, and it's doing so right now as it goes in hot pursuit of a seal in the shallows. Again, it can miscalculate and end up dead, and it's spending a tremendous amount of energy to do that. You'll see the surface of the water, you'll see the bottom, you'll see some breaking surf, but what you don't see in this particular sequence is the death of a seal, because this white shark strikes out, right? It does not successfully feed on a seal, but it's blown a whole bunch of energy. So you just sprinted, but you lost the race. Nonetheless, you still have to rest. And that's exactly what this white shark's going to do. It's going to swim out into deep water, spend the next half hour to 45 minutes, maybe an hour in deep water. Then it's going to try again. And it'll repeat this sequence of events, hoping to attack and successfully kill a seal. If it fails to kill a seal over periods of time, perhaps in excess of a week, the shark is going to move on to another area and probably leave Cape Cod and try a different strategy elsewhere. So if we look at each screen grab of the shark sequence, there's actually a seal in this particular image that the shark was very close to getting, but the seal saw the shark and moved away and was able to elude capture. But what's really fascinating about this technology, remember all those data we're collecting? Some of that's pictured on the left. It allows us to recreate what that shark did in three-dimensional space during that sequence, right? So here we are observing shark behavior, but we're not there. So imagine what we're able to do using these new technologies that didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is this evolution of technology over the course of my career, which is really like gone from, a horse and buggy up to a Corvette. And that's been really fascinating, and I also talk about in the book some of the other shark research that got me to where I am today. Because before I didn't really start studying white sharks until 2009. And for 20 years prior to that, I had been studying, dozens of species, not only here in New England, but around the world. So I talk about my growth as a scientist in the book as it coincides with the evolution of this technology, as I move away from, studying dead fish to studying live fish. And so, where do white sharks go when they leave? We've used a lot of satellite technology. And let's just walk through the evolution over the last, 40 years. Remember, this is Frank Carey's track in 1979, landmark study that gave us a 3-day glimpse into the biology of this animal and the behavior of this animal. We then jumped to 1985 when Jack Casey and Wes Pratt put together this compilation showing the distribution of the white sharks. Now let's jump ahead to 2024 when I amass the millions of data points we've collected that show the true distribution of the great white shark in the Western North Atlantic. And here you can see our massive data set that shows a distribution that's far more extensive than we originally thought, that extends out into offshore areas. And what's really fascinating is the new technologies are telling us that when these sharks move out to these offshore areas, they dive to remarkable depths. So if you look at this graph on the right side, you see when the shark is on the continental shelf close to Massachusetts. Then you see when it goes out toward the Azores, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Sargasso Sea, toward Bermuda, diving to depths in excess of 1,000 meters. So over 3,000 feet through an incredibly broad temperature range as reflected in the colors in this figure. And so these are mysteries that we're just beginning to reveal about this incredible species. And of course, we don't know why they do these big migrations, but I'm sure that over the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to have the technologies that allow us to do that. So stay tuned. Our research continues. I hope you buy the book, go to the library, get the book, read it, let me know what you think. I left out so much, but hopefully provided some teasers relative to this remarkable species. If you're interested in white sharks, you want to see more of our data, I work very, very closely with the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. If you go to their website, you'll not only see the white shark catalog, which is shown in the lower left here, where we've cataloged over 700 individuals that have visited Cape Cod, but also you'll see some of our acoustic data in the white shark logbook. Of course, you can download the Sharktivity app to see where these sharks spend their time. It's some of our live data as they come in. And with that, I'm going to thank you guys, thank a number of folks, including the Conservancy and other foundations that have funded us over the years, as well as National Geographic Discovery Channel, various individuals. And I not only have Chasing Shadows, but I have the Shark Handbook and the Great White Shark Handbook, which just came out last month. So I see a whole bunch of probably questions in the chat. I don't know how we're doing on time, Helen. I went a few minutes over. You let me know what you want to do, but I can begin to start to tease out some of these comments. Oh,
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Greg. Such wonderful, fascinating data and footage. So I'm sure people would love to have you answer some of their questions. So I can ask them or you can go through them. There's some also in the Q&A, however you'd like to do them.
yeah, you know what I'll do is I'll start with the chat room here. I want to welcome my friend from the UK. That's awesome. It's a testament to your reach, Helen. That's great. I hope you found the talk fascinating. Were captures intentional or bycatch? So all my little green dots. Most of them were bycatch. You know, longliners catching white sharks when they're targeting swordfish or tunas. Some of them are intentional, particularly the recreational harpooners who went out to target white sharks. So yes, there were both involved in that. I agree that Jaws is one of the best movies ever made. I love the quote. Do we ever bring non-scientists out with us tagging? As you can imagine, we bring folks who contribute to our research, so donors and sponsors, the media in general, film companies, and students. Otherwise, non-scientists are generally folks who contribute to the program through the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. There's a question here, why are there so many shark attacks on humans? I think that's not correct. I think it has more to do with shark attack reports than there are actual shark attacks. If you look at the International Shark Attack file from Florida, they've maintained records for many, many years, and there's less than 100 shark attacks, typically somewhere around 80 to 85 on a global scale each year. And if you think of the number of humans in the water, that's a really small amount, particularly if you compare it to other sources of mortality in humans. And you've all heard the many analogies from lightning strikes to dog bites. So shark attack is actually a very low probability event, and only about 10% of them are fatal. But as I said, they do have a profound impact. Do sharks tend to live their life regionally, or does a shark travel all over the globe? Typically not over the globe, and they typically will stay within an ocean basin, but they have definite seasonal movements. And I'm happy to reference papers that we've written about that. Where do they go to mate? Very good question. Do they mate in Cape Cod? We don't know. We have no evidence that they're mating in Cape Cod, but we don't have any evidence of where they do mate. We would assume that where adult males and adult females overlap, mating would occur. We do have some of that on Cape Cod, but we don't see the mating. So we don't know if it's actually happening. And it's a great mystery. It's a great question. You know, thank you to the others. Can't wait to read the book. Thank you. Thank you for the compliments. Yeah. When the sharks are swimming so deep, 3,000 feet, how are they able to breathe? Now, remember, they have gills. And of course, they don't have air pockets, so they don't have to worry about decompression, illness, and any of that stuff that we have to worry about. So they're capable of diving those depths, and there's ample oxygen, depending on where they are. Now, they could hit in an anoxic zone, in which case they will go shallow again. They will not stay in areas where there's not enough oxygen to breathe. But most places they go, there's ample amounts of O2, and they draw it from the water using their gills. What are the results from the Herring Cove study? Yes, that's probably referencing the fact that we do have an acoustic array, a very fine scale array, just like I showed you off Head of the Meadow in Herring Cove. And so those results are being analyzed by Brian Laguerre from the Center for Coastal Studies, and he has not completed it. It's part of his PhD. So I appreciate that. I bet the shark that jumped at you was trying to scare you. Yeah, it did a good job of that. And thank you to Rebecca for being a fan of my work. Do we get any useful, I like this one. Do we get any useful info by studying captive sharks? Yes, some. Captive sharks typically, though, grow at faster rates. we get a little bit of information about behavior, and certainly their physiology in terms of what they need to be healthy and to survive. So a lot of great work done on shark health, coming from captive scenarios. But in terms of natural behavior, typically not. Any white sharks off Plum Island, only as occasional visitors. They do not spend any time in that neck of the woods. They are transient. They move along the coastline up into the Gulf of Maine, and they come back through. So there's nothing to hold them there. And I'll say that with the caveat of yet. Let me click up here on the Q&A part because we got 5 there. So that one I've already answered. I don't know. Oh, yeah. Specimens from the blowhole, yes. So drones are now we used drones several years ago to actually follow white sharks in Mexico as part of a show we did for Discovery called Shark Cam. And they're very useful. And now they're being used by folks all over the world for various sampling techniques. And then this question, we see that the whale watcher folks are using modified drones to gather specimens from the blowholes. So, snot bots, they're called. Pretty interesting stuff. I think the drone revolution is here, and the sensors are getting better, batteries are getting better. And I'm pretty excited about the use of drones, and we're learning a lot from drones. Let me see. I know we've recently seen a hammerhead and thresher in the Cape. We call poor beagles, threshers, hammerheads. People ask how many. Obviously this talk is about great white sharks because the public's fascinated by them, but I find the public's fascinated by all species of sharks, and we have about a dozen species that occur here. I have a general talk I do about sharks that occur off New England, the seasonality of them, the research we've done on them over the years. Many of them stay offshore, meaning several miles from the coastline, but some do come close to shore. Demetra here is talking about poor beagles, hammerheads, threshers. There's blues, there's makos, you name it. We got a number of shark species, and perhaps I go into that in another talk for you guys. Oh, that's interesting. Sarah had a daughter that came out with us. How can we get your book? Hopefully, I think Helen put something up. Amazon, by the way, carries it. They're at the library as well. Barnes and Noble. So all the major outlets have all 3 of my books. And I don't mention the other dozen books I did on aquarium keeping, which would clearly bore all of you to death. White sharks will eat a lot of things other than seals. People tend to think of them just shifting to seals and exclusively, but they don't. I dissected a white shark years ago that had the head of a seal as well as the body of a striped bass. And we have seen them consume other small sharks. We've also seen them eat dolphins, porpoises. They tend to like larger prey, and they really love to scavenge whale carcasses. Now, what's also interesting about white sharks, and I didn't talk too much about it, I kind of alluded to it, smaller white sharks do not feed on large prey like seals and sea lions. They feed almost exclusively on schooling species of fish, bottom species of fish, and squid. All right, so those sharks are really well adapted for chasing down fish, as opposed to when they get larger, they go through kind of a puberty, their body shape changes, their muscular morphology changes, their teeth change, and they become really effective at dispatching large prey. Okay, we talk about, Thomas is talking about the vengeance sport fishing after the movie Jaws. And that's actually quite true. We call it the Jaws effect, where the people not only were afraid of sharks in general, and I do know people to this day who still are after seeing the film, but also there was the development of a massive recreational fishery targeting sharks, because sharks were easy prey, and after all, they were the scourge of the ocean, and they wanted to eat people. And so sharks took a big hit recreationally and also commercially in the 90s when shark fisheries started to really explode targeting them for their meat and fins. When do they reach sexual maturity? This is, given the growth curve that we published and I showed you, based on that growth curve, males don't mature until they're in their mid-20s and females not until their late 20s, early 30s, which is really slow growth rate and late ages of maturity. So when we talk about managing white sharks from a resource perspective, so conservation, we have to be really careful, and we have to almost treat them like we would marine mammals in that they have really low reproductive rates and slow growth rates. Here's one. I'm curious, with the success of the seal population, these sharks' subsequent hotspots, is it possible our sharks could lose their federal protection in the near future? I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. I don't think the seals are going to lose their protection either. It's a good question. And believe me, there are interests out there who would like to stop protecting both of them. And I often debate with them about this. But as of now, I believe that these species are going to be off limits for many years to come. My family summered at Salisbury Beach, sandy stretch, yep. Not uncommon to see sharks swimming that stretch. Yep. Didn't see seals, but I'm assuming there were schools of fish that attracted the sharks. Yes, absolutely. You point out a very big issue we have as scientists, in that long-term data sets. In the 80s and 90s, when shark fisheries really exploded, we from a conservation fishery manager perspective, were caught with our pants down, so to speak. We didn't have any long-term data sets at the species-specific level, dating back to like the 50s or 60s, that would give us a sense of what was happening with shark populations. And so it was a real problem. Now, since the 70s and 80s, we've amassed massive data sets that have allowed us to model these populations more effectively, but it was a real big problem. And the same is true for seals, by the way. People ask me all the time, have we restored seals? And no one can really answer the question because we'd have no real historical data sets. Roseanne asks if is there any technology that can repel sharks? And I know there's several companies that build shark deterrents. Their effectiveness is limited, but there are folks who believe they do work, but certainly none of them work 100% of the time. Most of them generate electrical fields that are thought to repel sharks. We are on the verge of perhaps testing some of those in the coming weeks as we're collaborating with some folks from Australia who are coming out to visit. So keep you posted on that. And I think with that, I've kind of knocked them all out in a relatively short time. So I appreciate everybody coming to this, and I thank you for your attention and your support.
Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation and taking the time to answer all of our questions. Chock full of information, and just loved the footage. So thank you again.
You're very welcome. Everybody enjoy the waning days of summer.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks again,
you.
Greg.
Yep. Thank you.